J'ai du tout pour prendre l'avion.
It might be that these pilots have experienced these kinds of situations in their past, and the captain considers the relief pilot to have more experience and know how to deal with the situation. But it's just a theory. Now the relief pilot is at the pilot monitoring seat, and the first officer is pilot flying and effectively pilot in command according to Air France standard procedures. Pilots started discussing the weather conditions ahead. The officer mentioned the intertropical convergence zone. At this position, there was no discussion about changing the course of flight to avoid the cells. The pilots asked each other about their rest condition, and we can assume they were a bit fatigued. The first pilot asked the relief pilot if he was able to sleep, and the relief pilot asked the first pilot if he was okay. The relief pilot also left his pilot chair in aft position and did not move forward in flying position in order to relax. In this case, he will be unable to fly immediately if needed, which he soon would need to. At 2:06, the first officer contacted the cabin crew and told them they will face light turbulence and also advised them to be careful. It was around 4 minutes the captain left the cockpit, and the next 4 minutes an emergency sequence would begin. The relief pilot reaches out to gain the weather radar and change it to max, which makes the weather screen more highlighted and prominent about the weather condition ahead. At this time, the relief pilot asked the first officer if can move the aircraft a bit left to avoid the weather condition ahead. They both agreed and moved the aircraft around 12 degrees and left. They had left their planned flight route with radio and air traffic control. But after some time, the pitot tubes are freezing up by water crystals, making them providing inaccurate data to the aircraft system. At 2:10, the autothrottle and autopilot disconnected with the cavalry charge warning in the cockpit. At the same time, a heavy round of wind started banking aircraft sharply to the right. The first officer called out, "I have controls," and reached to his side stick. Now this sudden change in aircraft behavior and all warnings can cause confusion immediately. But at this point the aircraft was flying okay with only this right banking addition. As the aircraft continued banking right, the indicated airspeed on the captain's primary flight display as well on standby indicator suddenly dropped from 275 knots to 60 knots. A very bad indication. The display started giving wrong speed and altitude indications of sudden drop in 300 feet and negative vertical speed. The first officer, who had been suddenly thrown into hand flying the aircraft, now reacted instinctively by giving left aileron and pitching up to correct his altitude. This was the start of emergency sequences which ultimately ended up doomed the aircraft and 228 people with it.
Dis-moi, dans 2 minutes, on devrait passer une zone où ça devrait bouger un peu plus.
The system of aircraft was showing unreliable data such as overspeed, bank protection, and angle of attack protections were lost. Now the first officer pilot flying needs to be more concentrated in order to stop aircraft banking and return to normal flight. He started over-correcting the stick and started causing more oscillations from right to left and vice versa. He was concentrating and pitching up at this point, resulting in a very high rate of climb. As soon as the autopilot disconnected, the plane dashboard started giving different warnings, and a brief stall warning was also heard in the cockpit. When the warning sounded, the relief pilot called out, "What is that?" Most likely because of the quick nature of the warnings, and it can also be interpreted that the pilot was getting confused in understanding the meaning of all these warnings. The flight directors were not disconnected, but the command bar disappeared due to unreliable data. 11 seconds, and the pitch of the aircraft was 11° nose up. And the first pilot flying was still over-correcting the plane position and also saying, "We have not a good display," referring to speed info. The relief pilot was supposed to handle the ECOM warnings and other abnormal checklists. He called out, "We have lost the speed." He also mentioned the auto thrust is lost. On that, the first pilot responded, "The engine lever?" showing the confusion due to difficulty in understanding the relief pilot. Since the auto throttle disconnected when failure occurred, the thrust went into engine thrust locked mode, which means it would keep the previously selected value, which was 84%. ECOM instructed the pilots to move the thrust lever manually to resume the thrust control, but instead the first pilot officer pushed the auto throttle disconnect button and left the thrust lever where it was in climb. The thrust now started into climb thrust, and all of this happened in 18 seconds. There were 10 multiple different messages showing up on ECOM screen, causing clanging in the cockpit. Not only this, now master warning and master caution warning also showed up in front of pilots, as well as C-chord sound, imaging the very confusing and stressful environment for the pilots. Airspeed is something which pilots have to figure out themselves and not appear in ECOMs. This caused the standard safety procedure not executed at this point. At 2:10, the aircraft's pitch-up altitude reached 12 degrees nose up. The aircraft was now climbing 6,900 per minute, 7 times higher than the normal rate of climbing as it passed 36,000 feet. Suddenly, the flight director bars reappeared in front of the pilot flying, but instead of being engaged in altitude hold mode, they were now engaged in vertical speed mode since they activated in the middle of the climb. This means now flight directors showing the pilot that pitch needed to maintain the current 6,000 feet per minute climb. And this was not helpful at all. The first pilot flying became more and more overloaded by noise and operating. It was all due to unreliable airspeed memory items, including turning off the flight directors. The relief pilot now reached to switch on the wing anti-ice, and that is where he noticed the high-pitch aircraft was continuously keeping. Then called out, "Watch your speed," referring to vertical speed. The first officer said, Okay, I am going back down," and started pitching forward, but not enough. The relief pilot continued to call out that he needed to stabilize. According to all three, "You're going up, so go back down." First pilot flying responded, "Okay." The pitch up reduced about 10 degrees, but still gave a climb rate about 4,000 feet per minute. They now climbed through their calculated max altitude of 37,000 feet. At 2 hours, 10 minutes, and 36 seconds, the flight directors disappeared again, but the airspeed came back, indicating the speed 223 knots. Now the aircraft lost about 50 knots of airspeed, and the speed was still reducing. The flight directors lit up again for a second, but disappeared, and came back again, commanding a climb of about 1,400 per minute, which was what the aircraft was doing at that time. At around 2 hours, 10 minutes, and 47 seconds SEC, the first pilot flying inexplicably now reduced the thrust back around 85%. N1. This is the sign of losing situational awareness, disorientation, and control. Now the relief pilot is continuously calling back to the captain and saying, "Where is he?" After this, he changed the air data selector and altitude heading selector to first officer on 3. These switches are designed to change the data displays. He tried for the sake of restoring the instrument that he felt was missing for this first pilot flying officer. 3 seconds later, the stall warning went off and sounded for 45 seconds continuously. But the sound was not discussed by any of the pilots. Instead of this, the first pilot flying officer pulled back the manual controls and changed the aircraft position to 16 degrees nose upward, just like takeoff position. This pitch-up command now also caused the stabilizer at the back of the aircraft to start moving into the maximum nose-up position and making recovery more harder. The aircraft had not enough energy to keep up the climb rate and started level off side to side. The first pilot flying was desperately trying hard to tackle the situation with the manual control stick. But the aircraft is now going into a fully developed stall. A stall happens when aircraft wings move beyond the critical angle wind attack, meaning the aircraft will not be able to climb. Instead, it starts falling off. Both pilots had received training in stall recovery years ago in demo aircrafts, but they do not know how to recover from a fully developed stall in real aircraft. And the Airbus only has audio warning, not visual signs of stall indication. At 2 hours, 10 minutes, and 57 seconds, the violent buffeting started to shake the aircraft very badly. This is different from turbulence and high in intensity. The first pilot flying officer now added the full toga thrust, but at this point the aircraft simply did not have enough energy to climb, even to keep the speed. The relief pilot called out, above all, to try to touch the lateral control as little as possible. But the intense first officer continued to move the control stick left and right. With toga mode, the aircraft can climb a few feet up and then start falling down toward the Atlantic Ocean. At 2:11:07, the ice on pitot tubes cleared out due to heating, and the airspeed indicator started working again. The airspeed indicated was 183 knots, which meant they had lost around 90 knots of airspeed. The craft is now moving faster towards the sea with the stall warning sound. The relief pilot called out, "But we have got engines. Do you understand what's happening?" The first pilot was continuously moving the stick without any response. It might be possible that the human brain is not capable of taking the right decision under this kind of stress. At 2 hours 11 minutes and 32 seconds, the first pilot flying officer called out, "I don't have control of the airplane now. I don't have airplane control at all." The relief pilot responded, "Controls to the left," meaning he took control. He made brief input to the left of his own controls before the first officer tooled back the control and continued his inputs. At this moment, the aircraft was falling more than flying. At 2 hours 11 minutes and 42 seconds, the captain returned to the cockpit and said, "What are you doing?" The relief pilot responded, "What's happening? I don't know what's happening." The first officer said, "We are losing control of the airplane." The relief pilot said, "We have lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We have tried everything." The pilots are now trying to troubleshoot, but they are confused because no aircraft seems to appear in this situation ever. The aircraft was descending between 10 to 15,000 feet per minute with the nose oscillating between 8 degrees nose down and 15 degrees nose up. When aircraft pitched downward, the stall warning starts again, and when pitched up, the stall warning disappears. The bank angle is not varying from 20 to 40 degrees right. At 2 hours 12 minutes and 10 seconds, the thrust again moved into the climb detent, and 20 seconds later, the aircraft stops banking to the right and started oscillating left and right. The captain was completely perplexed and did not know what to do, as he was not aware about the prior emergency situation of the aircraft. Such an unfortunate thing. At this point, the first officer positions the side stick fully forward for a few seconds, and this causes the pitch down and the speed to start increasing. All the pilots were trying to recover from the situation, but ended up making it more worse. The relief pilot asked for controls. The first officer gave the controls to the relief pilot, but after some time, knowing the relief pilot has control, the first officer started making his inputs. As a result, a dual input error appeared. After this, the pilots tried to pull up, but it was too late. Here are the last words of the pilots before the crash.
Pas tapé.